What happens inside the head when you learn a second language? Welcome everyone to another episode of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. I'm your host here, Kyron, live on the 19th of March, 2025. And as you might surmise, this is the podcast where I flex on my being a bilingual upon all of you lowly monolingual plebs out there. Worship me. Worship the bilinguals. Okay, no, we won't be doing that today, although we will be looking at the Bilingual Brain that we have by Albert Costa and what it tells us about the science of language, with that being the subtitle there. So this was published in 2017, originally in Spanish, and I've got the 2019 translated version into English here. I actually didn't know that before I started this, otherwise I might have tried to have sourced the original Spanish. It's 148 pages, probably 4 hours reading in total. You get some like little graphs and stuff within here that contribute to the pages, but the page count's relatively dense but it's a smallish book as well. It's just not that super big. It's a quick summary, I would say, of academic research on bilingual versus monolingual speakers as a whole. So what he's really looking at here is the effects that having a second language can have on the actual brain structure, on processing time, on language count, on social effects within people, behavioral differences, physical wiring. Think of things like response times, of vocabulary count, of overall memory and recall of words and things like this. So gray matter density, for example. There's 5 chapters within the book, and I will highlight them a little bit more, but they go under the names of Bilingual Cradles, 2 Languages, 1 Brain, How Does Bilingualism Sculpt the Brain, Mental Gymnastics and Making Decisions, and then there's some further reading, and there are some like graphs and stuff within the book that you can see as well. So let's jump on to the main question from all of this. What does learning a second language do to your brain? And there's associated sub-questions within this as well. So I'm going to give you a PSA at the start here. Public service announcement. Hold on to your horses. Don't get too deep into this because it's on the topic of social sciences by and large. So there's many problems that you can already have and see within this book. Biases of publishing and papers that are show an effect rather than don't show an effect tend to get published more and therefore get talked about more and researched more, and et cetera. Impossibility of finding reasonable sizes of bilinguals and monolinguals. Typically the studies in this book were of a couple of hundred people max, so you're not getting huge sizes of the actual studies. Filtering out cultural, educational variables, very difficult. What the hell is even a bilingual, you might ask, because as one in the chat was asking, if I know how to speak multiple languages, i.e. I know a couple of words in this language, does that make me bilingual? I think by and large, the definitions of this would not be, but is a baby bilingual? Is a child who knows a couple of words in another language bilingual, even though, they only know it in 2 languages? Is someone who learnt it later in life bilingual? What if they learnt it as a baby and then forgot it? Are they bilingual? A lot of good questions related to this that don't really get answered. He kind of just skips over and says like monolingual obviously only speaks 1 language, and then bilingual is, it's a little bit up in the air. So differences of learning it via TV, via school, or is, what exactly is it that we're measuring? He doesn't get into that particularly, and I think that is kind of, I suppose, shows up later in the book. So let's get off into the actual chapters. So he starts off with babies in this cradle section, before moving on to how can 2 languages actually coexist in the brain, what happens in the kind of switching process between them, language processing itself in terms of words coming in. So think of response times, things like this, and recall, how attention is affected. So if you're switching between languages, what is your kind of measure of how quick you can do that, as well as ability to interpret words and things like this. And then finally, decision making. If you're if you know two languages, do you make better decisions in your first language versus second language, things like this. So even though he puts it as monolingual versus bilingual, a lot of the book also is diving into how an individual person responds and behaves in their first language versus their second language. And typically there will be a dominant language versus their second language, which will be less dominant. So, typically there will be two groups. They'll have a control study, and they'll do things like word recall of picture naming for Alzheimer patients, for example, in their different languages, pattern tasks. Usually it will have like a small one-off study, and then he'll kind of interpret the meaning of this and what he thinks this means. So, he'll have an individual study, and it's kind of like, it's a little bit loose. There's little sub-chapters within these, I guess, but he'll have one in the two languages, one brain here section on interference. So what actually happens and interferes when you're switching languages, for example. But it's kind of a little bit loose. Personally, I found the studies kind of boring after a while, and that it was, I'm already jumping into, I guess, like a little bit of subjective my opinion in here. But I feel like if I just presented the studies and said, this is what the book said, I'd be doing a bit of a disservice to you as the reader at home. So what kind of studies would he have? So there'll be ones like, as you can see in the picture on your screen now, there'll be a baby. It'll have speakers coming from, like there'll be a focal point on a TV screen in front of the baby that they're to look at, but the actual speakers will be hidden behind two pictures, I believe, of their mum on either side. And it kind of measures like when the person starts speaking in one language versus their second language or whatever, will the baby turn and look, and it focuses their attention and shows like, oh, okay, they'll focus their attention on this area for this long for monolinguals and bilinguals in their maternal or in their second language, something like this. There'll also be ones where it'll have a person speaking to a baby, and it's how much of the baby's attention is focused on the mouth versus just looking around in general. So these are the kind of things that you see for the babies, and then for other studies, they're kind of like how I mentioned before. What I would say, if I had to partition the studies as a whole, would be that most of it was on the generalities of qualitative people preferences, or how people kind of behave. So you're measuring something like a baby's focal attention. So you're measuring something, but it's kind of like qualitative in a way that, what is the reason this baby is looking at something? And, is there a difference between me focused staring intently at the camera as I am right now versus me just wandering around and in generality looking in the direction of it whilst I'm also trying to think. Then you'll have quantitative measures on kind of qualitative actions or things that come. So this would be like the response times, and when you're measuring, okay, it takes this person this long to respond to a question or a picture, and how long that'll come up. So there are quantitative measures, but it is kind of still on what I would say is like a qualitative thing. And then there's only a little bit on the actual cerebral findings of something that I would say is a little bit more rock solid, such as gray matter density in the brain, or activation of certain parts of the brain when speaking a first or second language, which you'll see through the cutout plates of the cross sections of the brain. Just in general with these type of books, they can be a little bit liberal, I think, with their presenting of their findings. So, this study presented this, and then this is what this means, and it can, I feel like, just go a little bit too far, and just the way they're stating things, without also acknowledging okay, this could just be a local phenomena, or this could just be a bias in the way they constructed their studies. And if you want more of this, go check out the replication crisis of social studies, which was pretty much just like a decimation of all of these behavioral things that we'd found over the years that applied to humans. And it's like, oh, okay, most of these studies were just one-offs and weren't actual truth or ground reality. And probably the thing that put me off the most in this book was the guesswork. So sure, okay, I'll take some of these studies at face value in that, yes, what they measured is actually correct and their measuring system was good. But what do they mean? Well, and then validating what they actually mean as truth, and that what they're measuring is actually what they think they're measuring. So, for example, the baby section was probably the most iffy in terms of the findings. One himself says in the chat, "My toddler will just walk away from the test." I wonder how much of that actually would happen, where the baby's like not even doing what they're meant to be. They're trying to measure eye contact, eye attention, and the baby's just like closing their eyes and falling asleep. Who knows? There's a couple of things in this section which really kind of irked me, where he was saying like, babies are hearing their mother's voices in the womb for 9 months, where it's like, well, they don't even have ears for a large portion of that time. So I very much doubt they're hearing it for the full 9 months. It's a little bit sloppy saying that, using words as like or dislike to describe what the baby's doing, where it's like, I don't know, this could just seem like chaos. For example, bilingual babies look at mouths longer. If they're if someone's talking to them and it's a monolingual baby, their parent or whoever it is in their first language, they'll be like looking around the room. They'll probably look at the person for a little bit, but then look elsewhere and things like this. Whereas they measured, okay, bilingual babies, if someone's talking, they spend more time on average looking at the person's mouth. Now, what do you make from this in terms of the meaning of this? He said, okay, this obviously means that the bilingual baby is trying to interpret which language is being spoken, and they need as much information as possible to do this. Hence, they're going to look at the mouth movements, because that also plays a large portion of speaking and interpreting things. Lip reading is a thing, for example. And this is why the baby does that. And the real question is, okay, let's take them at face value. Yep, they measured accurately, and sure enough, the bilingual babies were looking longer. But is that the real reason for why they're doing it? Maybe staring just helps concentration, and they just happen to stare at a person's mouth because that's where stimulation was coming from. What if it's because they're aren't really staring and their eyes are glazing over? They're entering some sort of like hypnotic trance, for example, and they're more interested in just the humming or something like this. What if bilingual babies are just hungrier in general, and there's some food scraps left on these people's mouths? Or, okay, that one's a bit far out there, but you get my gist. There is plenty of different ways and reasons why you could interpret many of these studies to say, okay, well, sure, we measured this, but what are you actually measuring, and what does it mean is a big thing. So, okay, what did I learn from this book? What do I think this book actually really has to teach us about languages and language, not really learning, but knowing a second language versus knowing one language? What can you take out from this? What are some things which are probably truer in the most extent that I would take? My high-level takeaway is that bilingualism rarely is a detractor from first language due to the action nature of the skill. So if you learn a second language, your first language is not going to get poorer because of that. It's not like learning a second language makes you more confused in your first language. It's not like growing up with two languages is actually detrimentally like crossing neurons or paths in your brain and physically making you stupider or less able to react or lowering your IQ or whatever it is. That is not what is actually happening. Rather, any detractions that one might notice is pretty much due to not spending as much time practicing your first language, i.e., if you're spending time on a second language, then you're obviously probably going to be taking time from your first language. So, for example, if you got two babies, and this is kind of what should generally happen, if you had two babies and one baby spent 10,000 hours over their first, I don't know, like 3 years, being talked to in only one language and practicing that language. If you had another bilingual baby that spent 10,000 hours on their first native language and then also 3,000 hours on their second, so they just added more, they should be as perfectly capable in that first language, and they should also know a bit of the second language. However, that's probably rare, and what would most likely happen is they'd spend 7,000 hours on their first and then 3,000 on their second, and therefore they'll know less words. And you can see this with things like children or people in high school and things like this. If they are bilingual, they'll tend to not have as many words for domestic situations and like nuances of domestic stuff, because usually what will happen is they're speaking their first or second language at home, that their parents are speaking to them, or perhaps grandparents, and then at school they're learning the language of the actual country they're in and things like this. So what actually can happen is there's something such as it costing more effort to switch between languages, and funnily enough, in particular, switching from your second language back into your first is more costly than switching from your first into your second, or your dominant into your less dominant, which is rather interesting. I would have assumed it would have been the going from dominant to non-dominant would be harder in terms of like response times, of kind of warming up the system, but that's actually not the case. And this is because there's inhibitory processes to stop you just like accidentally speaking Spanglish, for example, where it's like, yo quiero ir to the bathroom, something like that, which would be, I want to go to the bathroom, or quiero ir al baño. So there's some interesting stuff when it comes to that, but by and large, learning a second language is not going to make your baby stupider. It's not going to make you stupider. It's not taking away from something that already exists, is probably the best way of saying it. Any downsides that there are likely not intellectual in nature, and are more likely to be emotional in nature. So, for example, people prefer, kids, and I think people in general, prefer people with accents that are similar to theirs rather than those with dissimilar accents. And this is even stronger than racial biases, for example. So kids at school would rather be friends with someone who speaks like them rather than someone who looks like them but doesn't speak like them, which is pretty interesting. The other downsides is that emotionally, in your second language, in your what is likely to be your non-dominant language, once again, this is getting into the hard bits, because your first language you could have learnt as a child, such like Juan did, my co-host, and you could say, okay, that's his first language, should be his dominant language. That would be incorrect, because from age 9 to 33 as he is now, he's mostly been speaking English. So even though English is his second language, it is his dominant language. So trying to sort this out between all of these studies would just be an absolute nightmare. So they probably, basic tests of getting people in would be like, do you speak two languages? Okay, prove that you can via this simple test or whatever. All right, you're in. And this is the really hard stuff to do. So in your second language, or in your non-dominant language, actually, I'm not actually sure of this, because he doesn't really qualify that in this particular study. But basically, you will be emotionally less kind of capable in your second or non-dominant language, whichever one of the two it is. And so you're more likely to use swear words incorrectly. You're more likely to actually, funnily enough, have a bit of emotional distance, so you won't get caught up in things as emotionally charged, perhaps politics, perhaps religion, perhaps things like this. In your second language, words themselves don't fire off emotional areas in your brain. And Yeah, the only other kind of downside is that learning a second language is really, really fucking hard. And so you got to spend a lot of time on it. So, me knowing Spanish and having read Spanish books, for example, probably has cost me a couple of words in English because I wouldn't have read, a book which had an obscure English word, which I would have then maybe have learned. It's kind of hard to tell. So there's a couple of things related to like the emotional side of things, but by and large, if you are a bilingual speaker, you have a different kind of like emotional response in your second language or your non-dominant language, but intellectually speaking, it's not going to harm you. So if you're thinking like, goddamn, I'm scared of raising my baby as bilingual, chill out about that. It's more likely to be emotional stuff of having two different cultures, for example, or of misinterpreting words in their non-dominant language, and then, perhaps saying things that they shouldn't say or which would be harmful in those sort of contexts. But in terms of IQ, raw IQ and things like that, you're going to be fine. Okay, let's jump on to the author, some extra details. It's actually really hard to find details on him. Basically, the best I can do is on the little blurb at the back here. So Albert Costa was research professor at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona and the director of speech production and bilingualism group at the Center for Brain and Cognition. His research focused on the cognitive and neural underpinnings of language processing. He said he had like 20 or 30 years of experience, I believe, in this. Likely, from what I can interpret, that he retired from the university and then kind of had all of this knowledge over the years and was like, might as well write a book. It was kind of the feeling I got because I believe this is a one-time author, and had some free time on his hands. I actually quite liked him. His style of writing was, look, he's talking about studies, so it's kind of boring, but he added enough interesting stuff about himself, about small little quips here and there, personal touches I really enjoyed. For example, it's rare to find someone encouraging people to read other books. So he talked about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Bad Science, Thinking, Fast and Slow, for example, and encourage you to stop this book and go read another, which, is terrible. I'm sure his publisher hates him for it, but it's a kind of generous thing to do in that respect. Thanking patients who've contributed to science, particularly when it's kind of degrading in nature, such as like a lot of the Alzheimer's tests and, making people feel foolish on purpose. What happens in some of these studies. He did pretty decent job of kind of devil's advocate, giving thought to ideas, and was kind of nuanced in some of his interpretations of these findings and just how rock solid the science actually is. Corny dad jokes, he had them all. He came across as a really likable guy. So in terms of the actual reading of this and his style, it was good. I enjoyed actually reading him as an author. Which gets us onto our summary with some similar books recommendations. It's a mildly interesting read on a topic I find really fascinating. What you're not going to find in this book is tips, techniques on learning a second language, on things like that. No, it's pretty much based on if you have a second language or what is actually going to, or are bilingual, what is actually going to happen within your brain and likely to parts of your, I'm not going to say personality, but the behavioural effects that of you interacting with other people and using languages. So I didn't really expect that myself coming in, which was kind of good. I kind of figured, it's about the brain, so it'll probably be studies. It's written by a researcher, so although there is, the quirky stuff, it is still rather dry reading. Getting through this at points was like, oh, okay, I'm reading this study, which seems pretty similar to a lot of the other studies for, the fourth or fifth time. It's great, I think, for the kind of overall context, the meta context, but, that was me having learnt from previous books, scientific books like this, of, okay, don't take everything in here as gospel, but it's not particularly riveting. And even the last chapter, for example, it just kind of ends. Like, it doesn't really have a sum up of the every general everything of the book. So it's look, he's a researcher. He's not an author. So don't expect it to be particularly compelling. So overall, The Bilingual Brain by Albert Costa, it's a little bit meh. 4.5 out of 10. I don't know. It was okay, but I'm not gonna rant and rave about this for sure. Similar books. Look, he mentioned Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. I've done a book review on that before. Very similar outcome, I think, that I took from this, which was individual studies. Don't hang your hat on any of these being really real. But the general trend of what they're describing is probably correct. So I think it's similar in that respect. Similar to like Sperm Wars in essence. It's got that kind of feel. It's that type of book. But it's much better than Sperm Wars though. So don't read that one. Which I have not done a book review on, but I talk about quite often because that book tricked me. That was the one which made me immune to, okay, a lot of scientific studies don't really hold up to the test of time. And we're going to end it there for today with the value for value section. Thank you for joining in, first of all. Very much appreciated. I do all of this, and my co-host Juan also does this for free. There's no ads, no sponsorships, no nothing in this podcast. We just provide this value up front, and we ask that you provide it back in turn. So there's many different ways of doing this. Sharing the link, word of mouth is super critical. So telling a friend, hey, I saw this book review on the Mere Mortals book reviews. Check it out. It's really good. I really like Kyron. I really like Juan as a host. They're bilingual, so therefore they must be super smart and educated. You could, like, subscribe, comment, all those sorts of things. Give me some book review recommendations. I would love to hear those. What you think I would enjoy based on previous ones and past ones. What's your favorite book of all time? I'm really fascinated by what people are really drawn into. And then finally, you can send some treasure our way as a thank you for support. And you can do that via meremortalspodcast.com/support. And there's also a PayPal link down below. Join in on a podcasting app where you can send in money directly within the app. One like Fountain or TrueFans, Castamatic, Podverse, Podcast Guru are all solid options as well. Finally, I am live here as usual on 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday. Juan was asking actually right at the start here. Speaking multiple language enhances cognitive flexibility, delays of, dementia, and the processing cost. He has the processing cost thing, speaking when I try to change languages really, really quickly, which is probably also noticed with me. I struggle, especially when the languages are similar, such as Portuguese and Spanish, and I've got differences between those. I struggle to switch between them. And if my brain is kind of stuck in one of them, moving over to the other one requires a real mental cost and effort, and it's not instantaneous click. So, joining in on our live stream as well. The live stream is really appreciated, and giving me a little bit of feedback is pretty fun. What's coming up in the future? I'm currently reading the Tao of Pooh and the Tay of Piglet. I've got a Taoism book coming up. So I'm reading that, and I've got a whole stack of books at the library waiting for me to pick up tomorrow. So, more on that in the future. Juan's been chucking up a couple of episodes of the random books that he's been reading as well. So, as always, more to come in the future. I really do hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. Ciao for now. Karen out. Bye.